Welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott, and I'm here with Samantha Hislop and Robert Crooks, discussing what is possibly the most dangerous week in the Cuban Revolution for many, many decades, perhaps since the special period, perhaps since the early days. The risk of U.S. invasion, the risk of U.S. encirclement and naval blockade, of U.S. interference against trade partners is stated and severe. And it's a time of emergency for the solidarity movements in which we are participant. So there's an awful lot to say, and it's really important to come together and start to think about how we are going to move in solidarity with the Cuban people this week. How is it looking to everyone here at the moment?
So as of Thursday, January 29th, Donald Trump signed an executive order which threatens tariffs on any country that provides oil, or I think fuel, more broadly, fuel to Cuba. So that's a huge, a significant escalation in the sanctions and economic asphyxiation regime that the U.S. has been imposing on Cuba for over 6 decades. It's probably the most serious measure ever taken against Cuba. And as of right now, to our knowledge, there are no oil shipments on the way to Cuba right now. And Pemex, which is Mexico's state oil company, canceled a shipment. I think we found out about it maybe the next day. I don't know when the cancellation actually happened. It may have taken place before the executive order, but it came out in Bloomberg about a day after the executive order was signed that Pemex canceled a shipment, and the tanker that had left for Cuba was on its way back to Mexico and would not be delivering oil to Cuba. And the estimates are that Cuba currently has enough oil to last somewhere between, about up to 3 weeks. And then domestically, we know that Cuba can only supply about 40% of its domestic needs. That's how much it produces internally. So 40% is produced internally, which I know they have been trying to increase their internal production recently. And I don't know how much progress was made there, but we know that up till now, they've only been producing 40% of their domestic need, and the other 60% had to be imported from other countries. So this is it's a barbaric measure, first of all. I have to say that. It's absolutely disgusting, but it can have the most severe consequences that we can really think of, because any country needs oil. Every country needs oil. There's no country that doesn't use oil, and it's needed for the most basic of services, obviously, for hospitals, surgeries, incubators, dialysis machines, refrigeration, electricity, water, sanitation, literally everything. I don't have to explain that, I guess, but they need oil. Cuba needs oil, and they need to be able to import oil, and the United States has signed this executive order. So that's where we are right now. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in and add to that, or...
Yeah, no, I think it's good that you explained the implications of this, because a lot of people might think, there's no oil, so they can't run automobiles, which would be bad enough in some ways. You can't deliver food, you can't have ambulances and things of that nature, but they need oil to power their electrical grid, basically. And so no electricity means, like the things you were saying, spoiled food means no energy for hospitals. And Cuba has been suffering under this blockade. I think actually today is the 64th anniversary of Kennedy signing the blockade against Cuba. And, just by chance, it seems to be one of the coldest weeks in Cuba ever. I saw some places it was getting down to 0 degrees Celsius, so freezing temperature. And the country's already having daily blackouts because of the blockade and because they can't get the parts they need to update their electrical grid due to the blockade. So I don't really know how people are staying warm. And then, there's all these other things that need to be taken care of. And I think it's, one of the very many signs of how, Cuba is really the example of how to put human need before everything. I read an article today saying that the Cuban government has been busy installing portable charging stations that each are accompanied by a solar panel into the homes of people who need a continuous supply of electricity due to different health conditions such as cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy. So people who basically need machines and other things like that to stay alive. This is a barbaric genocidal act by the Trump administration, but the Cuban government, like always, are doing everything they can to ensure that the impact on the most vulnerable people is, as little as possible.
Yeah, it's profound. The home solar solutions, I think, will be a matter of life and death for so many. And, this opens on to the broader question of solar in general and what kinds of assistance is en route. We've been talking about this for a long time. When we speak about how crucial oil is to the everyday operations of the Cuban economy and, just daily life, it's worth noting that Cuba's energy sector is uniquely vulnerable in this respect because, shall we say, inadequately resourced and diversified as an outcome of the blockade. We need to explain that Cuba has a 1970s era, sort of Soviet era power grid that runs on oil. They did not yet make it to, for example, the conversion that we see in the same decade in the United States to natural gas and so on. This is an entirely outmoded infrastructure by many 21st century standards as a result of the blockade. But it needs a constant supply of oil to stay running.
Yeah.
There'd been some very exciting news about Chinese assistance in the form of solar panels. But this is last year concerning the rolling blackouts as a result of far less acute shortages and the cascading impacts of Hurricane Melissa and so on. So when the Cubans are talking about 90-odd solar parks by 2027, this is an incredible advantage and suits their environmental planning and et cetera, et cetera. This is not the kind of retrofit that you can do with 3 weeks of oil left. I would echo Rob here. I really appreciate your just breaking down what the actual impacts are going to be, Samantha, because it has all kinds of unexpected effects as well. In the aftermath of Hurricane Melissa, we were reading about the outbreak of chikungunya, right, which is a mosquito-borne virus. This was also a result of power outages because when the power goes off, the water system stops. So people were saving water in barrels and cisterns and so on and creating a lot of standing water outside of what would typically have been mosquito season. And to Rob's point about automobiles, sanitation trucks and waste removal
and the
wasn't
fumigation
happening.
too. That was a big one. They didn't have the trucks to do the fumigation because they didn't have fuel for the trucks. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you see these videos of people wandering around doing it on foot and astonishing accommodations, but stop gaps, always emergency measures things you don't even think about. So suddenly you're reading in the press, and we always have to connect the dots about this outbreak of this terrible illness. This is directly connected to the oil shortages that you can read about on another page of the paper, and it's connected to the aggression against Venezuela, which is choking off their major vendor, supplying a third of their oil. So I think producing some kind of composite of all of these different headlines is also one of our urgent tasks. People need to understand that it's not just a travel advisory. Oh, if you go to Cuba, you might get this mosquito-borne illness. And isn't that so frightening? Well, this is in the nature of underdevelopment and economic warfare. One is directly the outcome of the other.
Yeah, and let's add too that like the entire region, they have those mosquito-borne illnesses, those outbreaks. In these other countries, I'm sure that in the tourist areas, the governments there and the private corporations, they make sure that those areas are perfectly fumigated, but everybody else is left behind, in the outskirts. So it's very common. We just don't hear about it. But in Cuba, as usual, they really blow it up when these things happen.
Yeah, I think they even have it in some southern states of the U.S. Yeah, and I think, this is, this order from Trump, where he calls Cuba a threat to national security, which is obviously, nobody believes that.
Preposterous.
They're making that claim based on their, first it was China has spy bases. Now it's Russia has spy bases.
Like, you wonder why they are even bothering anymore. Like, nobody believes it. Like, it's not even necessary, Like, why even say it? It's so outrageous. It's ridiculous.
Absolutely. And, I think we even saw the resuscitation of the Havana syndrome in some reports, which is just like, that was
They said they found the device, right? That it's attributed to. It's some backpack sized. I make experimental music. I'd love to know what they're using to induce these effects, but it's farcical.
Yeah, it's so ridiculous. And then in the meantime, you have Trump saying Cuba's not going to last long. You have Rubio saying we want to see regime change. In Cuba, even when, the Senate was being like, will you promise to not do regime change? Which is a ridiculous thing, right? They're having this public hearing and they're like, will you promise not to do regime change in a sovereign country? And, Rubio was basically like, well, we want regime change. And, you saw Salazar talking about how she doesn't care if children and mothers die, because that'll be for the greater good. So they know what they're doing. They know how lethal this measure is going to be, but they're just ghouls, And of course, this comes right in the wake of kidnapping Maduro, and Cuba is certainly aware of that. The U.S. has a very, very poor record of attempting to invade Cuba. They've gotten their ass kicked every single time. But it does, Cuba's not ruling anything out. And I was even reading an article from AP earlier that this is even affecting U.S.'s relationship with Vietnam, where Vietnam sees the U.S. in like internal documents. They're calling U.S. An existential threat to their own country because of what's going on in what happened in Venezuela and what's happening with Cuba right now, even though the two countries have made trade deals and on the surface are, in some ways allies, I guess. But the Vietnamese government isn't sort of falling for it and is being very cautious because of what they see happening in the Caribbean and Latin America.
I want to just say one thing, because it really bothers me and I just want to call it out. I don't know if it was one of these Congress people that were behind this, and a ton of counter-revolutionaries saying this on social media, saying Now you're going to see what a blockade is. Like, this is a blockade. There was no blockade before, but this is a blockade. This is a coercive measure. It's a threat of tariffs on any country that trades oil with Cuba or provides oil to Cuba. The same as the sanctions, it's the same thing. So that just really, really ticks me off. I don't know what kind of mental gymnastics like people, these right-wing believers like have to do in their mind to like go along with that stupid narrative that suddenly, okay, now we're doing a blockade. This is the blockade. Like, it's just targeting the most like essential material supply for the country. That's why it's so much worse. But I just think that's really stupid and really disingenuous, and like, it's bullshit. And I just wanted to say that because it's really been bothering me.
Well, and it's, like these very far right, anti-government Cubans. They've been showing up a lot. I've seen them all over the internet, like more than I feel like I've ever seen them. But even like some of them, like there was that op-ed in Cyber Cuba, that right-wing
CIA cutout funded outlet. Yeah.
That one, yeah, where like they're basically funded just to criticize the Cuban government, and in ridiculous terms, like all of the criticisms are. But even they had an op-ed saying like, this isn't how you deal with the problem. Like, this is going to punish everybody in Cuba. This is not going to hurt, in their terms, this isn't going to hurt the dictatorship. But even they're recognizing that this is going to hurt the whole population of Cuba, that you're punishing every single person that lives in Cuba. And, look at how angry Canada, like the media and the politicians about the tariffs against Canada. Yet, like, Trump can just say we're going to tariff anybody who sends oil to Cuba. How is, like, we all know that's illegal, but how are countries not just being like, well, fuck you, we can do whatever we want? Like, how dare you tell us who we can trade with? I mean, they've been doing it for a long time, I understand, but like, it's just insane how Trump and the U.S. government keep overstepping the bounds, and no one's stopping them. Like, there's even speculation that they're trying to bring down the United Nations because they owe something like $700 million to the UN, and like the UN is like, we have no money, you need to pay us. And obviously Trump's not going to, he doesn't care. Yeah.
They're just getting more and more emboldened every step that they take, and there's no pushback. Like, it's sliding, it's getting more slippery, and it's sliding faster is what it feels like. Something needs to give, because if there's any sovereignty, if that's a thing, then now is the time, right? Like, and I think that's why, that's one reason why Cuba is so important, because if something happens to Cuba, the whole world, not just the region, the whole world, the whole global south especially, is going to see that. And the United States is going to see that too, and they're going to think that they can, it's going to change everything, is what I'm saying. It's going to change everything internationally, globally, and sovereignty will have no meaning anymore, because Cuba is like the epitome of independence and sovereignty.
And this is why the executive order has to exaggerate the threat that Cuba poses. Now, on one hand, we should absolutely condemn this fabricated account of the threat that Cuba poses. And Miguel Diaz-Canel and many others have said very, very plainly, Cuba has posed no threat, right, to the United States in any of the respects that this executive order claims. But let's also be real amongst ourselves, right? Cuba is a terrible threat to U.S. hegemony. Cuba poses a very, very serious obstacle to U.S. global ambition, in spite of its small size and so on, because it is a global node of this network of counter-hegemonic and anti-systemic projects that the United States has hoped to disperse since the counter-revolution in the USSR and so on, and the attempted sort of recolonization, neo-colonization of a lot of the non-aligned movement countries and so on. But Cuba is a really, really important sort of anti-systemic nodal point and incubator of these movements, and its internationalism is renowned, and it not only has implemented on its own territory, but projects a vision of a very democratic, equitable, humane, planned economy that, you know, it is an ideological threat, at least to the United States. The specific accusations that have caused the U.S. to defame Cuba and place it on the state sponsors of terrorism list having to do with its relations either to Colombia or Palestine or many other countries. This is basically fraudulent or a recasting of these international relationships. This idea that, perhaps there are Chinese spy bases in Cuba and so on. The exaggeration of Cuba's military threat is scarcely believable. But the simplest account, and I don't know that the moment benefits from simplicity necessarily, but this is nonetheless truthful, is that the United States is trying to complete its enclosure, its capture, its domination of the region. You know, and Cuba is, for a very, very small island, you know, probably the major bulwark against the U.S. vision for that region. And then, you know, another thing I want to say, because we have to imagine what sorts of effects this total blockade is going to exert. We've been, within the Cuban network in this podcast, annotating the denialism of the architects of the blockade, right? And a lot of liberal commentators too. You can read this garbage in the CBC from time to time, people saying this is not a blockade. I remember there's one headline that haunts me, you know, there is no blockade of Cuba. So on one hand, these the architects of the blockade and the people who maintain its instrumentation have been denying its status as such for so long. And now they're saying, oh, you want to see a blockade, and turning up the heat. This is fresh off of the movement for a free Palestine, the whole world watching in riveted horror as we see what starvation as a weapon practically looks like. So there can be no mistaking what they mean when they say this is a real blockade. But when even right-wing Cuban outlets are saying this is collective punishment, this is just going to crush the entirety of the Cuban people, how long does it take to break through? Something that I've been worrying about, because the methods have to change. The incredible participation, almost to a head, of the entire Cuban people, their conscription in the cause of the revolution. Another one of the reasons why Cuba is such an excellent example is because, you know, we talk about 85% of women in Cuba being in the FMC or something like this. You look at the committees for the defense of the revolution, you look at their military preparedness, the drills pertaining to a war of the entire people. This is a society of cadre, honestly. You know, the people are not passive participants or incidental beneficiaries of planned economy. So the typical means of regime change are not going to work. You know, the color revolutions we saw in July some years ago, that phony uprising, was numerically insignificant. It's probably not going to take in Cuba. But one thing that I've been puzzling over that we talked about previously, you know, there was this weird pivot last year where it seemed like Trump was actually attacking his base by deporting a bunch of right-wing Cuban Americans. Whereas previously, as part of the mechanics of brain drain, the U.S. would have expedited their visas and been like, oh, come one, come all, you know? Why are they suddenly sending these people back? And I think it's to change the on-the-ground demography of the revolution so that there is a larger quotient of society that's ready to pop off out of seething discontent, because they never had that revolutionary buy-in in the first place.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking a lot about too. Some of the artists in Miami that are getting arrested and deported, They have been there for some of them for so long, like 10, 15 years, and they don't have full status. Like, they definitely don't have citizenship, and obviously they don't have permanent residency because they're getting deported now. They are criminals, some of them violent criminals. Like, one was convicted of like second degree attempted murder, I don't know, like really bad stuff. And now is the moment when they're deciding to send them back to Cuba suddenly. So it is really interesting, because these are some really, really bad people. They're not going to do any good in Cuba, that's for sure.
That said, Carlos Jimenez, another absolute traitor. His family were, I think, wealthy landowners under Batista. He's one of these Florida representatives who is promising to asphyxiate his own people for what little that's worth. And we can immediately see how any people is cleaved by class, where you have a guy like this saying there will be no oxygen to Cuba. I sorry for the words fail. Words fail. This is the most despicable thing you can imagine. But he's also saying, everybody who's in Cuba right now, get on a plane, come home. All the tourists come home because it's about to get very, very, very bad.
The embassies too. He's telling people in like European and like embassies that they better get out now while they can. Which is like, when you're saying that,
it means you know what you're doing. You know what you're trying to do. Yeah, like they know very well. They know a lot of people can get hurt and die. Many Cubans. Yeah. And the most vulnerable ones first, of course.
And this is what concerns me really are these characters. And on this podcast, we've sort of been, I know that we've been trying to keep a roster, as it were, of these right-wing legislators who are part of the anti-Cuba lobby. They, I believe, are the underrated factor in this sequence, because Trump, who says today, oh, we're going to make a deal with Cuba. We're talking to Cuba. We're going to make a deal. Now, it's funny. Some weeks ago when he said that, the revolutionary government responded and said, we've been trying to talk to the United States for a long time, and they are completely silent. They won't speak to us. So is Trump bluffing when he says that he's talking to Cuba and people are ready to make a deal? Of course. He's definitely bluffing. But Trump is a vaporous, ridiculous, mercenary personality. And this is how he sees the world. He's always hard bargaining. And I think that some people are expecting Trump to just change course. You know, he's hot and cold. He vacillates by the day. But he's being operated by these hardcore, bloodthirsty, sadistic people whose entire political vocation is to crush Cuba. And they've been designing this program for decades. I have seen some people whose optimism of this moment isn't yoked to the solidarity movements or even necessarily following the incredible resiliency of the Cuban people. They're just like, oh, Trump is going to change his mind. It's this very passive thing. He's desensitized all of us, I believe, in a way, by behaving so erratically on the world stage that every day there's some new gonzo headline, and then a week later it seems not to have been half of what was pledged. Okay. But I really think this might be different, because Trump is not the operator of this sequence. I think people should look at Rubio, and they should look at the people who are hardcore anti-Cuba ideologues, and they're using Trump.
You could see in the announcement, in the press conference when they announced the executive order, I think all three of them were there. Jimenez, Salazar, and who's the other one again? Oh God.
It could be Diaz-Balart.
They were like giddy, like gleeful, like standing beside him, like we finally did it, like we got him to do it, kind of thing. Like it was really, really gross. And that other lobbyist remember that the one that came to Canada and did that tour to discourage Canadians from going to Cuba, Orlando Gutierrez Boronat, the Assembly of Cuban Resistance lobby group. He was there. I think he was there too for that, and he was really happy. But yeah, you could see like they're the ones that they've been trying to do this for a really long time. Like this is this is like the highlight of their career and their lives. I think you're totally right. I don't, nobody should be expecting Trump to change his mind on this.
One of the funny things too is like Trump has been saying, yeah, like, oh, we're negotiating, we're going to make a deal. But yeah, the Cuban government is still saying, they're saying that we've been in contact, but we're not talking about any deal. And I think like the last thing they talked about communicating with the government over was because, so Mike Hammer, the charge d'affaires to Cuba, I guess was giving a couple public events in Cuba at churches where I think, you know, the U.S. I think thinks they have a better chance of dealing with people in the churches rather than like the rest of the Cuban population. But he was like yelled at, and they were calling him murderer. They were calling him imperialist. And, you know, the U.S. spun this into like, you know, the Cuban government attacked Mike Hammer. And so like the most recent thing I saw was that the government of Cuba was telling the U.S., no, Mike Hammer will be safe. We won't let anything happen to him. Like, it's so ridiculous, you know, like how upfront the Cubans are being, and the U.S. is just a complete farcical country in every sense, or like farcical government in every sense, except for how serious their actions actually are.
Absolutely. And, you know, just as a brief sidebar to that, the religious manipulation, you know, and treating churches as a reserve of counter-revolutionary sentiment. You know, and this is somewhat true. Some of Cuba's bishops are calling for reforms. There's no denying, in spite of the robust religious freedoms in Cuba, that some of these bishops harbor counter-revolutionary aspirations, right? Even they, and in particular the Pope, because this is a very, very interesting relationship that we've annotated as well, have come out scathingly against the U.S. escalations and this total blockade. So the religious base that Mike Hammer is trying to rally, this is a great example of why you have Cyber Cuba and these other historically right-wing platforms saying that this is going to be a calamity for everybody, because it's not going to discriminate. You know, it's going to reach every single person in Cuba.
Ho ricevuto con grande preoccupazione notizie circa un aumento delle tensioni tra Cuba e gli Stati Uniti d'America, due paesi vicini. Mi unisco al messaggio dei vescovi cubani invitando tutti i responsabili a promuovere un dialogo sincero ed efficace per evitare la violenza e ogni azione che possa aumentare le sofferenze del caro popolo cubano.
So, the situation right now seems really dire. Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico claimed that the decision to stop oil shipments was a sovereign decision. Clearly, this took place under duress and under direct threat of the United States. Mexico has since pledged humanitarian aid, and as of a day or so ago, potentially shipments of humanitarian oil. What happens now? What needs to happen to break or circumvent this blockade?
I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes that we don't see. I think that in general, the international community is appalled by this. We know that at the UN, they've stood against the blockade every year since, was it 92 was the first one? So I think there, you know, there's been a lot of condemnation by countries, including, you know, countries like China and Russia. At this point, we need more than words. Absolutely. I think that may seem easy to criticize someone like Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. I think that they're trying to negotiate with the U.S. to find out what can they do, like how can they send oil without getting tariffs. And this may seem like, well, it's capitulation, and if you don't stand up to Trump now, what's going to happen? Like, you're putting yourself in a very vulnerable position. But at the same time, Mexico cannot afford the tariffs that Trump is threatening because of how much they export to the U.S. market. So they're in a very vulnerable position. But there are other countries who are supposed allies with Cuba, who are BRICS members, who should have more resilience against U.S. threats, like U.S. economic threats. And, they need to stand up. I think there needs to be also like a united response from countries. Mm-hmm. Like if all of these countries say, you know what, we're going to do something, I think that's the only way they can do it. Like any single country by themselves is too vulnerable, but united, they can do something.
And it shouldn't have come to this. Like, this would have been great like decades ago, obviously. If countries, especially the largest economies in this hemisphere, came together and like studied their trade, found out like where their vulnerabilities are versus the vulnerabilities of the United States economy in terms of trade. Like, I feel like you said, united, they may be able to pull up some leverage with the United States, right? And also, again, I'm not an expert in trade, but a lot of what Mexico, and this would affect jobs, obviously, but a lot of what Mexico exports to the US is American corporate, like the auto sector anyway. So it's not like it's pure Mexican, companies or corporations that are producing something and they're going to lose out. It's actually US corporations themselves that their products are going to be tariffed. So we can all be appalled by this and be like, what about sovereignty? Like, you can't, but like, this is a brazen, bellicose, like, words don't cut it. There has to be some actions and some organization and some internationalism. That's the only way that this can be defeated. And if that doesn't happen, like, imperialism loves fragmentation. It's exactly what they want. Everybody's scared. Everybody trying to delay the inevitable by looking out for themselves right now. You're next. You're next on the menu. After Cuba, you're next. And if they see that they can do this to Cuba, Cuba has been the most resilient, the most firm, the most independent, the most sovereign country, has shown the most solidarity and internationalism since the revolution. They've always given not what they had left, the unequal reciprocity. The way that Cuba has given and assisted other countries despite their own struggles, we have to do something to step in and help Cuba get through this. Oil needs to get to Cuba, and it's not going to happen if everybody's just sitting back waiting for somebody else. It's not going to happen without organization and cooperation. And so I think that's what it comes down to. No more fragmentation, or I don't even want to think about it. But
like, I think, your point that those countries who are being pressured by the United States into not helping Cuba, that they are next on the menu, is so poignant, because this whole sort of episode didn't start with Cuba. We have to remember it started with Venezuela. So why would they stop after Cuba if they didn't stop after Venezuela?
Yeah. They were doing all that. They've been doing blowing up these boats in the Caribbean, killing fishermen. No consequences, none. And that's why they decided, okay, we can do this in Venezuela. We can do it. We're going to go ahead and do it. It's outrageous.
Yeah, and you obviously see how one thing concatenates another. The attacks on Venezuela choked off Cuba's major oil supplier. paved the way for the terrible effects of the present tariff regime. So on one hand, they see it like dominoes, without getting into wild speculation about the ways that the United States and Israel should like to manipulate the uprisings originating from the bazaar and so on in Iran. It's not a coincidence that Iran, which is a potential ally in this situation, is quite out of commission. Now, Iran was never, I want to be clear too, because I think that we should resist and try to re-narrate this tendency that people have, though I understand the desperation that produces it. There's kind of this fantasy baseball draft within the BRICS where people are like, where are all these other countries? Why aren't they sending oil? And I've been doing this as well. I'm thinking, well, China has oil fields and refineries, is not an oil exporting country. They've sent rice and other material aid. Brazil is an oil exporting country. I think 45% of their oil goes to China, and I don't need to break it down, but Brazil is nominally, an allied government of Cuba, or at least has a good relationship, is one of its major trade partners where food supplies are concerned. One can get ahead of oneself thinking about this, but the logistical regimes before any punitive tariff system are very complex. It's really hard to make this up overnight. Even so, when we look at the oil tanker with Venezuelan oil that was apprehended in advance of the January 3rd escalation in the region, I believe that was an Iranian ship. Like, you can see how all of these sequences are wrapped up in one another. The pretense is it's so inconsistent. In Granma, they were talking about a very weird American conservative article saying that Cuba is, whatever the United States makes of its political system, Cuba is its greatest regional ally in terms of the
security collaboration, they've
absolutely
been an excellent partner.
And if you read books by Cuban journalists about Cuba's war on drugs, because it's really notable. When Lindsey Graham says that Cuba is a narco-terrorist government, tries to use the same slight that was wielded against Maduro, and we talked about this last episode. When Lindsey Graham tries to say this about Cuba, there's this fascinating anecdote in a book by a Cuban journalist about their war on drugs, which is mostly about rehabilitation and recovery programs within Cuba, but it begins with this journalist saying, well, over the course of one of my investigations, I was on this boat that had been apprehended and was sitting at harbor, that it was transporting drugs. And I found their maps. I found their regional, all of their routing and so on, that these drug smugglers used. And Cuba wasn't even on their map of the region. He mentions this book is from, the better part of a decade ago, 30-odd apprehensions of people at airports and so on trying to smuggle drugs. Some very insignificant number compared to the corridor that the rest of Latin America has become. So, I think also we can see how these escalations are self-contradictory by the U.S.'s own account. We know that this is not about narcotics, but especially were it about narcotics, Cuba would be the last target.
It's interesting too, like with regards to going back to why doesn't Brazil send Cuba oil? I mean, absolutely. We also know that there's U.S. and Canadian ships in the Caribbean Sea right now, right? And I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what their actual, if you look on the Government of Canada website, it says that the HCMS Yellowknife is in the Caribbean Sea to fight drug trafficking. But is that what it's really doing? I don't know. And are they there to actually be a physical blockade to anything going to Cuba? And if that is the case, I have to admit this is speculative, but if that is the case, would that be true of a Russian tanker sending oil? Is this sort of, you talk about how the U.S. is engaged in Iran right now. They're doing this weird thing over Greenland. Is the U.S. positioning themselves for a much wider war? And are other countries seeing that and potentially not wanting to be the spark that sets that off.
That's the other thing that one hears most often. People say, why have these other countries who are part of this provisional sort of anti-systemic or counter-hegemonic bloc, why have they not rallied to Cuba? And the typical reply is pragmatism, because people understand that we are on the brink of a third world war.
But there are things that we can do today to prevent this scenario. One of the things that you can do is you can go to Canadian Network on Cuba.ca, and there you will find a material aid campaign around, that's still based around Hurricane Melissa. Cuba is still building itself out of the devastation that storm caused. So the Canadian Network on Cuba has sent 2 shipping containers full of material aid. There will be a third being sent, so you can donate to that. There's also something political you can do on the website, which is go to our petition, which we will be sending to the Parliament of Canada, and the government of Canada will be forced to respond to it. So we need to show the Canadian government, for what it's worth, that Canada stands with Cuba. And that may seem like a small thing, but I think that given the circumstances, this is one of the most important things that we can do right now in Canada.
Yeah, it's petition 7082. And like Rob said, it can be found on the Canadian Network on Cuba's website. It makes you feel really powerless and overwhelmed that these things are escalating so quickly, and to see Cuba so targeted right now. But the reason that we've come to this point is because we've been thinking that way and not acting for so long. We need to activate. And like Rob said, if you're not already involved in a solidarity organization or a peace organization or your union, or if you are in a union, talk about these things right now, because it has implications for the entire world, and most certainly for the working class. And right now, the working class in the Western Hemisphere, for sure. It's a really difficult situation, but we have to do something. And we would be in a much better place if we had taken action sooner. Maybe this wouldn't have happened with Venezuela, for example, with Maduro and Celia Flores getting kidnapped. There's a whole bunch of maybes and what ifs, right? But now is the time. Like, don't let those feelings stop you anymore. And
we'll be out in the streets, so join us. If you're in a city where there's a rally going on, get involved.
Yeah, you're going to see a lot, definitely from the Canadian Network on Cuba and its member organizations across the country. They'll be promoting their actions that they'll be doing in the streets and other events to raise awareness and to put some pressure on Canadian officials and members of Parliament to hopefully take some action and push back on this and step up to help Cuba. And so that's where you can find your information and how you can get involved. And there's going to be a lot going on. That's our job as working class people. That is our job. Yo soy un hombre sincero, de donde creen